Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening, and welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C.'s Foreign Policy Panel discussion, focusing on the U.S.-North Korea relations, the recent threats by North Korea, and the rising alarm in the international community at the actions of North Korea's new leader, Kim Jong-un. My name is Heidi Shoup. I'm president of the World Affairs Council, and it is my privilege to welcome you here and to introduce our distinguished panel. Our panel is made up of distinguished individuals. Each one could speak all evening on the Korea-U.S. relationship and the prospects for the future. Together, they will explore the current situation, place it in context of earlier moments of tension, and examine the possible scenarios ahead. I know we all look forward to their remarks. Our panelists are the Honorable Joseph DeTrani, Bonnie Glaser, and David Maxwell. Ambassador DeTrani is the president of the Intelligence and National Security Alliance. Previously, he's had a distinguished career in government service that included service at the Department of State as both the special envoy for negotiations, the six-party talks with North Korea, and as the U.S. representative to the Korea Energy Development Corporation. He served as director of East Asia operations at the CIA, and more recently, he was the senior advisor to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and the Director of the National Counterproliferation Center. Bonnie Glaser is a senior advisor for Asia in the Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington, where her work focuses on issues related to Chinese foreign and security policy. She has served as a consultant for various U.S. government offices, including the Departments of Defense and State. She also served as a member of the Defense Department's Defense Policy Board China Panel in 1997. David Maxwell is the Associate Director of the Center for Security Studies and the Security Studies Program of the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University here in Washington. A 30-year veteran of the United States Army, he retired as a colonel in the Special Forces. His final assignment was serving on the military faculty, teaching the national security strategy at the National War College. He spent the majority of his service time overseas, with nearly 25 years in Asia, including commanding the 1st Battalion, 1st Special Forces Group Airborne in Okinawa, Japan, from 2000 to 2002. Our moderator is Dr. Jae Jung Suh, an associate professor of Korea Studies at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, also here in Washington. He is a former faculty member of Cornell University's Department of Government, East Asia Program, and a former visiting scholar at MIT. He has been the recipient of the Fulbright Hays Faculty Research Abroad Fellowship and the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship on Peace and Security in a Changing World, among other numerous honors. We are delighted to have him here with us tonight and to have him lead our speakers as they help us understand the current state of relations and to place the current threats of war in context. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished speakers.
Well, thank you for inviting me to this distinguished meeting. I'm delighted to be part of an excellent group of speakers, panelists, and the audience. We have a very difficult problem and challenge in our hand. And as a moderator, I'll start by laying out some of the basic facts. The kind of threats and actions North Koreans have made in the past, in the recent month. And before I turn it over to our distinguished experts, North Korea has recently taken actions that escalate the already high military tension on the Korean peninsula. It has also made statements that only increase the worries that Americans have about the security of the world. Timing couldn't be any worse. these reckless actions and aggressive statements were made soon after North Koreans have conducted their nuclear test and the rocket test. And so I'll talk about three main things in my brief introductory remark. The first one is the actions that the North Koreans have taken that constitutes the source of concern. North Koreans have essentially taken two actions that demonstrated some technical capability. One, they launched a satellite last December that demonstrated that they have the capability to put an object in orbit. In last December, that object was a satellite, but it could be something else. The second technical capability that they have demonstrated is a nuclear weapons capability. They have conducted 3 nuclear tests, and the latest one was done last February. The latest one is a source of concern because the yield was the largest. We don't know the exact yield of the test, but estimates vary from 8 kilotons to as much as 40 kilotons. And again, we don't know all the details of their nuclear weapons programs and their nuclear capabilities, but the North Koreans have, since the test, claimed that they have succeeded in miniaturizing the warhead, making the warhead light, and diversifying the kind of nuclear weapons. And so if you put these two technical capabilities together, the ability to put an object in orbit and the ability to make a nuclear weapon small and light, you have essentially an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile capability nuclear weapon. Although this is a statement and claims that the North Koreans have made, we do not know for sure, and we'll turn to our experts on the panel to assess their technical capabilities and their statements. To these technical developments, North Koreans have added belligerent statements. You've probably heard many of these in the news. They nullified the armistice agreement, as well as other associated agreements with South Korea, and they disbanded the Panmunjom Communications Office that maintained the only channel of communication with the US forces in Korea. They also have made an explicit threat to, quote, turn Seoul and Washington into a sea of fire, unquote. They also claimed that any military confrontation would develop into an all-out war, a nuclear war. The reference to a nuclear war was made more real and ominous on March 2nd, when the North Foreign Ministry spokesperson said in a statement that the country will, quote, exercise the right of a first nuclear strike, unquote, against the US. Furthermore, the North military put its strategic rocket force on a top combat-ready posture on March 26th, and 3 days later, Kim Jong-un allegedly approved a strategic rocket forces plan for strike. The official media went to the trouble of showing a map that had a title, Strategic Rocket Forces Strike Plan, that displayed missile trajectories running from North Korea to points in US continent. So the combination of North Korea's nuclear and missile capabilities and statements is a cause of concern. And we'll turn to our experts to make better sense of their technical capability and their statements. But before I do so, I'd like to make a second comment. That is, North Korea's actions and statements need to be placed in the context of a strategic interaction with the US. Because North Korea itself after all, is an actor that interacts with outside forces. And when you look at the actions and reactions between the US and North Korea, one could make an argument that there is an element of tit for tat. The nuclear first strike statement issued by North Korea was made in response to the start of a Fall Eagle combined military exercises that the US forces and South Korean military began on March 1st. The North Korean military was put on the top combat-ready posture just a day after B-52 bombers flew over South Korea. And Kim Jong-un's approval of a strategic rocket forces strike plan was issued soon after the US Air Force flew B-2 bombers over South Korea. And of course, the US forces did not have a plan, did not make a decision to fly B-52s or B-2s before the start of the exercise, but it made the decision in response to North Korean actions. And so North Korea made some actions in response to US actions, and the US made some actions in response to North Korean actions. And the cycle of action-reaction has escalated and intensified the tension. So one could make a case that this is a classic case of a security dilemma that exists between the US and North Korea. And finally, I'd like to make a brief comment on domestic politics in North Korea. Kim Jong-un holds 3 positions: First Secretary of the Workers' Party of Korea, First Chairman of the National Defense Commission, and Supreme Commander of the Korean People's Army. And of these 3 positions, the last one, Supreme Commander of the DPRK force, is the most important position, and it is in fact the first position he was given. And last year, he acted in his capacity as the Supreme Commander to visit the frontline military posts and to make some military gestures. And his military visits and gestures provided, in a way, a justification for his becoming First Secretary of Workers' Party and First Chairman of the National Defense Commission. And so the position of a Supreme Commander has been an important source of his power and his legitimacy. And one could make the case that Kim Jong-un has been busy again this year, and he's been busy primarily as a Supreme Commander of the DPRK force, probably because he's again using his post to legitimize his power and consolidate his position as the leader of DPRK. So North Korean actions and statements have layers of complications and difficulties. The actions and statements themselves pose a threat, but they also have an element of a reaction, and they also have a component that is grounded in North Korea's domestic politics. And of course, North Korean actions need to be situated in the context of its relations with South Korea, China, as well as the US. And so all those complications make it difficult for us to understand why North Koreans do what they do and how dangerous their actions are. And in order to make a better sense of North Korea, we will now turn to 3 distinguished speakers, starting with Ambassador DeTrani.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Appreciate it. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the World Affairs Council for the invitation for all of us. Let me just speak very briefly about North Korea's nuclear programs and some of the negotiations we've been doing with North Korea. I mean, North Korea has been pursuing a nuclear program since the 80s. And this was Kim Il-sung. It goes back to Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of Kim Jong-un. And this was working with the Soviet Union at that time, looking for light water reactors, which would have been for civilian nuclear purposes. Soviet Union imploded, 91. They were not able to get the light water reactors from the Soviet Union. We had some problems in 1993. North Korea had joined the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty, and they were threatening in 1993 to pull out. We had the agreed framework, which was, as the professor explained, in 1993, it was probably just almost as intense as it is now, where they said they would make Seoul a sea of flames and so forth. And the predicate there was the IAEA felt North Korea, they have a facility at Yongbyon where they have a 5-megawatt reactor. And that's a plutonium reactor. They reprocess the spent fuel rods for plutonium for civilian nuclear purposes. The IAEA felt that there were some problems, and they were probing. And North Korea got offended by that, asked them to leave, said we would leave the NPT, and things got very tense. And that was the beginning of the agreed framework. And that's where we had negotiations in Geneva. And there was an agreement with the agreed framework that North Korea would halt all its activities at Yongbyon, the 5-megawatt reactor to reprocess spent fuel rods for plutonium. And in return, we would build 2 light water reactors for them at Kunmo in North Korea. And these are significant, 1,000-megawatt reactors. And in the interim, until they're built, we would provide them with heavy fuel oil. And they would get out of the nuclear business. And they would not need any nuclear. During that period of time, that was the agreed framework, we discovered that North Korea was also pursuing another path for nuclear capabilities, and that was uranium enrichment. This was presented to them in 2002 and negotiations in Pyongyang. Initially, they said, yes, we have this and other things, but then subsequent to that, they denied it. But the fact is, North Korea has 2 paths to having a nuclear weapons capability. One is plutonium, the facility at Yongbyon. We assess that they have reprocessed enough spent fuel for 4 to 8 nuclear weapons, plutonium-based nuclear weapons. The assessment also is that North Korea has this clandestine uranium enrichment program, which is also for nuclear weapons, which they've denied having. In 2010, Dr. Sig Hecker, former director of the Los Alamos laboratory, visited North Korea and visited a facility, they showed him at Yongbyon, with 2,000 spinning centrifuges. We hear about the centrifuges in Iran. These are spinning centrifuges in North Korea at Yongbyon. And according to Dr. Hecker, this was state of the art. This was a beautiful facility. And they said this would be for civilian purposes. Well, as the professor just mentioned, most recently Kim Jong-un said, by the way, we're going to enhance our nuclear weapons capability. And it's not only going to be based on plutonium, it's also going to be based on highly enriched uranium. And there's only one purpose for highly enriched uranium. So there's 2 paths to acquiring nuclear weapons, plutonium and highly enriched uranium. And North Korea, and certainly according to Kim Jong-un most recently, and we've known this all along, we've known this since the early 2000 period, has a capability of enriching uranium for nuclear weapons. And that's of concern. That's truly of concern. Because they are not part of the NPT. They pulled out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They have no IAEA inspectors there. And so the concern is that North Korea, if has nuclear weapons, and they're enhancing their capabilities. Second point, we've gone back to negotiations. In 2002, when we have this problem with North Korea on uranium enrichment, we started in 2003 the 6-party process. And that's where China, and Dr. Glaser will talk about that, came in and facilitated movement on the 6-party process, where we, with South Korea, with Japan, and the Republic of Korea, and the Russian Federation, would sit down with the North Koreans and say, let's work on denuclearization. For denuclearization, which you committed to with the agreed framework, we will provide security assurances, we provide economic assistance. Ultimately, it will be a path to normal relations with all of us, certainly with the United States, with the Republic of Korea, and with Japan. Indeed, they have relations with Russia and with the People's Republic of China. We had negotiations that started in 2003, August of 2003. They didn't go anywhere but until September 19, 2005. We had what we called the joint statement. The only time we had an actual joint statement with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. We all signed off on it. And what this joint statement said, and this was signed off by Kim Jong-il, the father of Kim Jong-un, North Korea will denuclearize, ultimately denuclearize, but actions for actions. And in return for denuclearization, they would get security assurances, economic assistance, and when they get rid of their nuclear weapons, dismantle the nuclear weapons, and come back to the NPT, the provision of light water reactors for civilian nuclear programs, and a path to normal relations. But we in the United States, because everybody has bilateral issues, this is the major issue that touches the 5 countries dealing with North Korea. But each country has a bilateral issues. The Republic of Korea on the reunification issue and also POWs, Japan on the abductee, the United States, illicit activities. If you want to have normal relations, sine qua non is you need to move towards denuclearization, but eventually you need to stop counterfeiting our $100 bill. You need to stop counterfeiting our cigarettes. You need to stop counterfeiting our pharmaceuticals. And there needs to be more transparency and progress on human rights issues, because these are our values. And if you want normal relations with the United States, it's not only denuclearization, these other aspects come into a relationship with the United States. And North Korea was prepared. We signed the joint statement and everything moved forward. It fell apart in 2007 when our lead negotiator, Christopher Hill, was dealing with them, indicated that their commitments to verification, oral commitments on verification, they'll open Yongbyon, oral commitments, we asked them to put it in writing, and they got a little upset with the writing, and they weren't too happy with that. We had taken them off the state sponsors of terrorism. We had addressed some of their issues, but there was a hiccup on the verification, putting it in writing. And since 2007, we have not met as a body, a 6-party talks group that we get together on this. And now what we've seen is we moved to Kim Jong-un, and I'll end here because Kim Jong-un came into power and there was great hope and a lot of enthusiasm that this young man will be a transformational character, a leader, and move North Korea. And he made some initial good decisions, we thought. Some of us, I certainly did, personnel decisions and what have you. Then we had the Leap Day Agreement, ladies and gentlemen. That's 29 February 2012. And in that agreement, North Korea had committed to moratorium on nuclear tests and missile launches. They had a missile launch in April and in December, as the professor indicated, and then they had a nuclear test just in February. So they broke that agreement, and that's where everything fell apart. We now have this imbroglio, we have these issues here. So the 6-party process is still on the table, although we've not met for a number of years. The joint statement is still on the table, committed to by his father, Kim Jong-il, although his son, Kim Jong-un, has never committed to it. So that's still there. But we have this period of great tension, as the professor indicated right now, significant tension, with North Korea saying the things they're saying. Certainly this goes way beyond the pale, and it's very disturbing. So these are some of the things there, and I'll end on this. Each time North Korea launched a missile and had a nuclear test, it was in violation to a UN Security Council resolution. And these UN Security Council resolutions, and the most recent one that was passed in late February, beginning of March, brings 193 countries together, the United Nations, that sanctions North Korea, which tells North Korea, you cannot sell these weapons, you cannot sell these missiles, because they have a very robust missile program. They have Scuds that go up to 1,000 kilometers. They have No-Dongs that go up to 3,000. And now they have Musadon, which is a road mobile system, which goes up to 3,000 kilometers. That touches Okinawa, certainly all of Japan, and up to Guam. And we're even looking at a road mobile ICBM. You cannot deal with this. You cannot be selling this. So they look at any transactions that touch North Korea's sales or acquisition of military equipment, but also the banking systems, because of what I mentioned before, ladies and gentlemen. They make money on selling these weapons and these missiles, but they also make money on illicit activities. So all the banks in these 193 countries are committed to ensuring that North Korea is not moving illicitly acquired money through their financial systems and so forth. So, and that really bites. It really bites. And we're also looking at moving bulk cash. So there are sanctions with Security Council resolutions. It's not just the U.S. North Korea is working on their missile program, on their nuclear programs, and we still have negotiations, but the negotiations have been at a standstill. And what we're seeing now is significant escalation. I pass to Dr. Glaser.
Thank you very much. I'm primarily going to talk about the involvement of China in this equation. North Korea is the only country that China has a security treaty with. It is an ally. In 1961, they signed a security treaty, and there actually is a clause that would require China to go to North Korea's defense under certain circumstances, although in fact I've heard that the Chinese have told the North Koreans that they would like to excise that clause, because indeed the Chinese have already gotten involved in one war in North Korea in the 1950s and really don't want to get involved in another one. The Chinese have very deep interests at stake in North Korea. They want to see the country first and foremost stable. They'd like to see it prosperous. China supplies about 50% of the food and I think about 85 to 90% of the imported energy that North Korea gets. And so China is really the only country that has significant leverage over North Korea. And first and foremost, I think the international community wants to see the Chinese actually enforce the sanctions that Ambassador DeTrani talked about that have been passed up at the United Nations. And we've seen a pattern of China really not strictly enforcing those sanctions. This time around, there are some signs that the Chinese are beginning to make it difficult for the North Koreans to engage in some financial transactions, but it remains to be seen how long they will do this and to what extent. So the Chinese they really have an interest in seeing North Korea get rid of these nuclear weapons. There is no doubt that China doesn't want yet another nuclear weapon state on its border. But, you know, denuclearization just isn't China's top priority. Preserving stability is. And so under the premise of preserving stability, they are willing to work with other countries to try and achieve denuclearization. And the Chinese worry if there are instability in North Korea, things could get very unpredictable. I mean, first of all, there could be potentially the chaos that spills over their border into northeast China. And the Chinese worry that there could be large numbers of refugees that would flow into China. But in fact, that's the one scenario that probably Beijing is better prepared for than any other. They actually have thought through how they would deal with refugees. And I believe that if they were limited numbers, that the Chinese could handle it. If you start getting into hundreds of thousands, then it becomes quite difficult. But the other aspects of instability are potentially very unpredictable for China. And this involves the possibility of intervention into North Korea, U.S. South Korean forces going over the 38th parallel into North Korea. We've seen reports in the Western media about how U.S. South Korean forces are exercising to prepare for the potential that they might have to go into North Korea to secure WMD, weapons of mass destruction sites. And this includes, of course, nuclear facilities. And the Chinese are worried about the unknown, the potential for reunification, where U.S. forces could end up being deployed closer to their border. There could be more listening posts on their border. They even worry that South Korea could inherit the nuclear weapons. And there have been no in-depth discussions between the U.S. and China and South Korea about the future of reunification and what that would mean and whether Chinese interests would be protected. Not because we don't want to have more conversations, not because South Korea doesn't want to have more conversations about how we would address instability, but primarily because China is very reluctant. So the Chinese would very much like, at this point, to have North Korea stop these provocations. When Kim Jong-un came to power, they too were hopeful that there would be a new leader in North Korea who would pursue some economic reform, who would care more about feeding his people, who would care less about provoking the world, as Kim Jong-il in his later years had created some serious provocations and even killed some South Koreans. And so I think that the Chinese are extremely frustrated and angry now with this new leader in North Korea, and they are trying to signal him to stop being defiant, to get in line, and to try and think about a different path. But China is still, even though it is very frustrated with North Korea, is still quite reluctant, I think, to work with the United States and other countries because they actually see the U.S. as part of the problem. Professor Suh talked about the B-52s and B-2s that were flying over this recent, in the recent exercise, although I actually think that exercise and that portion of the exercise was planned before. It was not in response to what North Korea was doing. Nevertheless, the Chinese did see that as provocative. Essentially, the Chinese believe that sanctions have to have a complementary diplomatic factor. In order to actually achieve any real result, you've got to sit down at the table. The United States has to talk about giving the security assurances that North Korea wants and providing humanitarian assistance and potentially light water reactors. Of course, the United States has done this before, so we have many people in our government, whether Republicans in the past or Democrats now, who believe we shouldn't really buy the same horse twice. We've done this before. There's a lot of frustration in the administration, and what North Korea is doing now is really particularly dangerous. But the Chinese are, I think, only going to work with the U.S. to the extent that we actually have a real diplomatic strategy to go along with the sanctions. And so at this point, I think we are at a moment where we are trying to get China to enforce the sanctions. Then we will perhaps, potentially, if North Korea backs down, doesn't launch this missile, refrains from more provocations, returns to its commitments under the September 2005 agreement that Ambassador DeTrani talked about, then we might be able to get back to the diplomatic effort under the six-party talks. But it is very hard to find, at least from my perspective, a path from here to there. And I think that in the absence of reopening some diplomatic channel, I don't think that we're going to have the Chinese on board with us for very long, even though our interests to some extent actually do overlap, although they don't completely coincide. So I'll stop there and turn the floor over to David Maxwell.
Thank you, Bonnie, and thank you to the World Affairs Council for having us. I'm going to talk about four things from the military perspective. I'm going to talk about the Republic of Korea, United States military alliance, because that really underpins everything that that goes on the Korean Peninsula. You know, the worst case, of course, is deliberate attack by the North and war on the peninsula. And let me be clear, if there is a war on the peninsula, the alliance will prevail. However, it will be very bloody, and the loss of life and treasure, and it will have global effects, because war on the peninsula will affect not only South Korea and the United States, but China, Russia, Japan, and have economic global impacts as well. So war is the worst case, but let me be clear, the war will be won by the alliance. Now, to understand the alliance, I think it's first important to understand North Korea's strategy. So let me just briefly outline that. The vital national interest of the Kim family regime is its own survival. That is number one. Its strategic aim remains unification of the peninsula under the control of the Kim family regime. The Kim family regime wants to be known as a power, as a player in the world, as well as being a nuclear power. And I think we are seeing evidence of its actions to become a nuclear power. And the last part of its strategy is that it must split the ROC-US alliance. The condition for it to be successful in unifying the peninsula, it must have U.S. forces off the peninsula. And so splitting the ROC-US alliance is a key part of its strategy. And we see for the last 60 years a key part of the playbook that Kim Il-sung started, that Kim Jong-il perfected, and that Kim Jong-un, to a great extent, I believe, is still following, is about splitting the alliance so that it can achieve the conditions that it needs to be successful. The most important thing, though, is that North Korea is very unlikely to attack into strength, to conduct a deliberate attack because it doesn't have the correlation of forces to be successful as long as the alliance exists, and it depends on surprise. And so as we see the current tensions now, the one thing I do take some solace in, I think it's unlikely that Kim Jong-un would initiate a deliberate attack. Of course, miscalculation is another story, and it will initiate attack if the regime is threatened. So if its survival is threatened, it could very well attack. Another threat to the regime also could come from within, and so the internal dynamics that are at play that we can't really see if the regime is threatened, that also may cause it to attack. And some of us call that the explosion-implosion paradox. Explosion, an attack, the implosion, threat from within could also lead to explosion, to an attack. So that's a very dangerous combination there. However, the strength of the ROK-US military alliance does deter deliberate attack, but it does not deter provocations. And as we've seen, 60 years of provocations with very little alliance response, except at certain times over the years. North Korea has been able to use provocations to gain political and economic concessions, and that's a key part of its strategy. And of course, with the nuclear program and its nuclear weapons, it is able to execute a blackmail diplomacy strategy to be able to get the political and economic concessions that it needs. I think the important thing, though, for nuclear weapons is that the regime believes that nuclear weapons are key to its survival. And they believe that it deters a U.S. preemptive attack. And when they look at Gaddafi, Saddam, and countries that have given up their nuclear weapons, they think that they would be very vulnerable without their nuclear program. Now, the ROK-US alliance has 60 years. Our Mutual Defense Treaty, 1953, a little longer than the Chinese-North Korean alliance. It has recently signed a plan for counter-provocation, and I think this is really key. I mentioned that there has not been a strong response to North Korean provocations over the years. I think the political conditions have changed in the Republic of Korea, and if North Korea conducts a kinetic provocation, another attack similar to what happened on Waipito in 2010, that the South Korean military will respond, and I think it must respond. However, it must respond immediately and at the point of provocation. What it must prevent is a delay and an attempt to go after strategic targets. So if North Korea conducts another artillery attack, South Korea is prepared to respond, and I think it should. And although that's counterintuitive to many, I think that we've seen in the past that when South Korea does stand up to the North does not respond. And that happened in 2010 when South Korea conducted the largest artillery training exercise in the face of North Korean rhetoric that they said they would respond, and they did not. Because they will not respond to a trained and ready force that exists. However, if there is a delay in a provocation, after a provocation occurs, and a desire to to strike deeper into North Korea, that is where miscalculation and escalation could occur, because the North could perceive that as a threat to the regime, and that is what could lead to a dangerous outcome. And so I think it's really, and many people will, would discount this, but I think it's key that if there is a kinetic provocation, that the South Korean military responds decisively at the time and place of the provocation. And that has the best chance of preventing escalation. Now, responses to other activities. The Musadan missile may be launched. Some people will call for that to be shot down, and I would say that if it does threaten South Korea or Japan, that it should be shot down. However, if it does not threaten ground targets, then I would recommend that it not be shot down, that we track it, we see what is, we gain intelligence from the missile firing, and then we take further actions diplomatically. The last point I want to make is about the alliance, and I am heartened by the fact that over the last few months, and really since 2007, the strength of the alliance has increased, and it is very strong right now. And I think that the strength of the alliance is really key to future diplomacy, because as long as the alliance remains strong and demonstrates strength and resolve, it leaves little for the North to exploit. It likes to find gaps and seams, and if it can't find any, then we have a better chance of having diplomatic action. And so a strong alliance really provides a foundation for diplomatic activities. But if we show weakness, or if we show that we don't have the strength and resolve, then the North is likely to exploit that, and we are unlikely to achieve we won't have any hope of achieving a diplomatic solution, which I think is what we all want. So the future, I think, rests on the strength of the ROK-US alliance, and I think the actions over the last 2 months during the exercises, the deployment of the B-52s, the B-2s, the stealth fighters, that demonstrates the U.S. commitment to the alliance, and I think that actually does more to prevent attack by the North than any other action. And so although we can think that there is a tit for tat, I think, as Bonnie said, I think these were deliberately planned operations to ensure deterrence, because deterrence is really the most important aspect of the alliance right now, because we do not want to see a deliberate attack or an attack due to miscalculation. And I'll stop there. And
This likelihood of a provocation on a regional, local level, and unlikelihood of a strategic nuclear strike also raise important questions about what we, the U.S. government, can do to minimize the risk. And as the speakers pointed out, we have a regional, local, and a global problem, as well as a short-term, a long-term problem. And so one policy probably won't solve all the problems, all the challenges we are faced with, but we probably need some combination of policies. And so let me ask the panelists, what should be the best policy response to these complex challenges that we are faced with?
Let's start it.
We'll start at that end. Start at that end. There you go.
We'll go this way.
All right.
let me just make one other point. I have seen numerous provocations over the years between North and South Korean military. Much gunfire has been exchanged, but also I would say that there has been a high level of discipline by both South Korean and North Korean soldiers to prevent escalation. So on the demilitarized zone, there have been many conflicts, hundreds over the years, that have not escalated. And I think that's a testament to the discipline of soldiers on both sides. I think that for as far as policy, I would turn to South Korea. And I am somewhat optimistic with President Park's trust politique. And I think that I'm hopeful that with her as the president and to implement that policy, that it may provide an opportunity for diplomatic, perhaps not a diplomatic solution, but a diplomatic path, hopefully that will arrive at a workable solution. I think that her policy is different than the Sunshine Policy, and I think that there is an opportunity for engagement. She has made some pretty important statements about not tying aid to the nuclear program. But what I think is different between 1997 and 2007, what is different now goes back to my opening remarks. The strength of the alliance provides a foundation for a diplomatic policy like trust politique to have a chance at working. So I would hope that South Korea will be able to take a strong lead with U.S. support to reduce tensions.
Well, I would agree that we should look to South Korea to take the lead. And President Park has some ideas about how she'd like to approach North Korea, but that is going to require North Korea to take some first steps. So I think that the U.S. certainly should first and foremost stand by our ally. Speaking to the China element of this, I think that when there is a danger of some real conflict or escalation on the peninsula, the silver lining is that's when the Chinese actually get motivated to do something. We saw this, for example, in early 2003. The Chinese had no interest in hosting what started as the three-party talks and later became the six-party talks. They insisted that the problem was the crux of the problem, as they said, was between the U.S. and North Korea. But for several reasons, they did decide to get more diplomatically involved. And I do think that this is a juncture where the Chinese could be encouraged to get more involved. And this has to be on the pressure side to begin with. There must be some credibility to the sanctions that have been passed up in the UN. I think that there must be some pressure that's been put on North Korea, not just from the 193 members but of the UN, but specifically from China, because of China's really critically important relationship with North Korea, that it would be a signal to North Korea that it cannot continue to go down this path forever. So I hope that we will see China, and also working with South Korea, because President Park, who actually speaks Chinese, was the former the envoy of the former president once to Beijing. I think there can potentially be more cooperation between China and South Korea. But I believe that we shouldn't put the cart before the horse, in the sense that we should not be talking about resumption of diplomacy until we have had a period in which we have seen some serious enforcement and strict enforcement of these sanctions.
No, I totally agree with Dr. Glaser. I think at this juncture we need to diffuse it. It's escalated to the point where there could be a miscalculation, and that would be disastrous. I don't think anyone expects North Korea to do something of a precipitous nature, if you will, an attack on the ROK or Japan, the United States. They're not suicidal, we know that, but they could be incremental, and that's that. So we're concerned. So China has the leverage over with respect to food, with respect to energy assistance, and moreover, they have a peace and friendship treaty that goes back to 1981, where they are committed to come to the defense of North Korea. So China China's the only country that can sit down with North Korea and say, look, this is enough. You've gone far enough. Let's walk it back. But not walking it back means coming back to the table and being serious about not disarmament talks, not non-proliferation issues, about denuclearization. Because if North Korea, we are to accept what Kim Jong-un has said, that I'm never giving up my nuclear weapons, that I'm going to enhance them, then we're talking about significant issues in the region and globally. In the region, a nuclear arms race. In the region, the possibility of proliferation issues that could touch a lot of weapons, devices, fissile material. And that's just the region. That's because the Republic of Korea and the government of Japan are just not going to sit there, and Taiwan, and then they just will not sit there. So there are many aspects to this. So it's got to be coming back to negotiations, and I think China can convince North Korea it's in their interest to come back, but come back to what Kim Jong-un's father had committed to, and that's denuclearization in return for security assurances, economic assistance, and all the other benefits. And security assurances are key. And the seminal issue here, the seminal document, is the joint statement, September 2005. And that would be the best. But just to come back, to have disarmament talks and to talk about non-proliferation, I don't think, as Dr. Glaser indicated, no one wants to go through this again. There's negotiation fatigue here. For 20 years, they're going on and on this issue while they enhance their program. It needs to be substantive and it needs to be progress. And that's what it is. And I think we've heard that from President Obama. We heard it from Secretary of State Kerry. We're willing, and certainly President Park and the Republic of Korea has reached out, as is Abe. And I agree with you. I think China is positioned right now. I agree with Dr. Glaser. China's position right now is to say that's enough, because it can get out of hand. And it's not in China's interest to see things get out of hand. Because if anything, the spillover in China would be significant, whether it's refugees, whether it's the potential for proliferation. So come back to negotiations, come back, commit yourself to ultimately the six-party process, with respect to implementation of the September 2005. Because if it's not the case, as was mentioned here, sanctions will bite, and sanctions are biting, and especially if China implements them. Because this has been, if you will, their safety net. China, beautiful. But with China implementing them as the other countries are, I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, I can't see how North Korea can survive. So I think the paths are pretty clear, either a path towards normal, ultimately normal relations and legitimacy, and another path towards, which would be further isolation. And we all know 23, 24 million people in North Korea with malnourishment and food issues and other issues there. That's not what the people of North Korea deserve.
Well, thank you so much. We have a lot of issues on the table, and I'm sure many of you have a question or questions to ask. So let me open the floor for questions.
Why couldn't the Chinese take the refugees that go into China and just take them into South Korea? That would sort of nettle North Korea and would get rid of the refugee problem. And the second on China, if somehow there is a war with North Korea, would China, like in 1952, intervene and send their forces into China? And what would the U.S. troops do? Would they just stay there, or would they actually be engaged? Thank you.
Well, it's
I'll-
a question made for you.
I'll try to take the first shot at it. There have been periods where there have been large numbers of refugees that have come out of North Korea into China. In recent years, it's really been a trickle, and some of those have been relocated in South Korea. Many of them have actually settled in China. The Chinese would find it a challenge to deal with very, very large numbers who would move into that area. I think South Korea might even find it a challenge to take at one shot, very, very large numbers. So it requires some planning. It requires just advance preparation as to how this would be managed. Maybe some of those North Korean refugees would go elsewhere. In fact, the U.S. government made a decision several years to start taking some North Korean refugees. I think we're still in the single digits, if I'm not mistaken, but one could imagine that we might take more too. So it really just requires some planning. But in the absence of planning, where you have potentially hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million people streaming into China, could be very destabilizing for China. On the answer to your second question, I think I addressed this a little bit in my earlier remarks, that the Chinese have no interest in entering a second Korean War. That does not mean that there are no circumstances in which they would. If they really felt that their vital security interests were threatened, then I think there are circumstances in which China would enter the Korean Peninsula with troops again. Probably a scenario in which the United States or South Korea started, they were the provocateur. I think it's highly unlikely, if North Korea is the provocateur, that they will get involved. And some people talk about scenarios of a potentially a pro-China leader being installed by the Chinese. I think that these are extremely unlikely. I've had one Chinese military officer say to me, if a person is terminally ill, you have to let them die. And and this was in the context of North Korea, if the North Koreans, if this state is collapsing politically, and if there is no way to really reconstitute it, and there's potential civil war factions that are fighting each other, you don't want to get on the wrong horse. Imagine how much hostility China would have with South Korea if they tried to support one faction that then didn't win. I think at the end of the day, the Chinese do not want to get involved in another conflict on the Korean Peninsula.
What if Kim Jong-un decides to just back off? Where are we then? All of a sudden we've, to use your equestrian analogy, we've now bought that horse for the third time or fourth time. So what are the likelihood that he'll just back off and we'll just go back to our ways of we've been doing it in the past?
If Kim Jong-un backs off, in many ways, that's an ideal scenario. Kim Jong-un escalated, and he needs to find a way to de-escalate. He's put this ball in play. He needs to find a way of moving it back. Obviously, he needs to save face. He's got to live in his own environment there. He's got to show strength as a new leader, a young leader. So we realize there's always, eventually he's going to have to find a way out. Question of de-escalation while saving face. But the sense also is that it's just not going to be okay. He's got to do something. He may do something. He may do something like we saw in 2010 with his father in the Jong-un in the Waipido Island. Or now we're looking at a Musudan. There's been a lot of talk about the launching of this Musudan. That would be something. He launches a missile and it's there and no consequences and what have you. That's the way. I think there could be a path for Kim Jong-un to de-escalate and save face and to still show the people around him in North Korea that he's the leader, because he needs that to survive. And we have to appreciate his environment. That's my colleague's comment here. His environment and his country on that. So I think I think it's a win-win in a lot of ways if he de-escalates and moves in that direction.
As far as off-ramping the current crisis, I do think, I think that's part of the problem with Kim Jong-un and his inexperience. I think Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il always had a way to off-ramp it. I was surprised that they had not launched the Musudan, because I agree with the ambassador that that may be the face-saving measure. I think it's very possible it could happen, timed with the end of the ROK-US exercises, so that they could initiate their propaganda narrative, one, to claim that they're a nuclear power, and two, to claim the end of the exercises is really a result of their demonstration of power causing the alliance to back down. I think we might see that in their propaganda narrative, and that might be the way that they off-ramp this, and then and then things will subside, and then later there will be a call for talks and the like.
North Korea, I think, would be smart, in fact, to refrain from launching this missile, because one of the objectives they might be able to achieve would be to drive a wedge between the United States and China. I would think that the Chinese would want to respond favorably, maybe even reward North Korea for doing the right thing. And not necessarily along with other countries, but it would probably ease up in its enforcement of the sanctions. So even in the absence of any agreement to return to the commitment to denuclearization, we would likely see China easing up on that, and then I think that would cause more problems for our desire to cooperate with the Chinese to achieve that long-term goal that we share.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, our three panelists.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.